The classic example of a national government is the one that was created by the French Revolution. Right? So when the French Revolution started, France's internal map, the map of the medieval regions of France, looked a lot like the map of the states of the United States today. Right? So on the East Coast you have little bitty Connecticut, little bitty Rhode Island, and then as you move west you have gigantic Montana and Texas and California. The same was true in medieval France. You have huge regions in the southwest, little bitty ones in the northeast. And what the revolutionaries did was they said, we are the nation. And they kind of took an etch-a-sketch and just erased all those internal lines. And then they drew new arrondissements, little regional administrative subdivisions. They're all more or less the same size. And that's what the internal map of France looks like now. Why did they draw these little regions that are all about the same size? And the answer is because it was convenient for the central government. That is, first came the center, and then the administrative subdivisions were created for its convenience. But that is a national model. First came the whole, then came the parts when the whole felt like it. And the alternative to that is a federal system, in which, as in today's Australia, which 100 years ago was 6 parts, and they decided to have one central government, or in Germany or Switzerland or the Netherlands or Canada or the US, first came the parts, and then they created the central government for some few purposes, leaving most of them to the states, right? So, when the Congress and the legislature sent people to Philadelphia in summer of 1787, they told them, we want you to propose amendments to the Articles of Confederation to make it adequate to the few purposes we've given it. Amendments to the Articles of Confederation. People wanted a federal system, not a national one. But what happened when they got to Philadelphia was some of these people, Alexander Hamilton, James Madison, some few of these people, had the idea that, really a national system would work better. We'd like a national system. They knew people didn't want a national system. And so here's what happened in Philadelphia. First day they met, first thing they did, George Washington is elected president of the convention. So we have 2 world-famous Americans at the time, Washington and Franklin. Franklin's an old man. He's a member of this convention. He stands up and he takes Washington by the arm and they walk down Central Aisle, and seats Washington in the front of the room. Washington will be the president of the convention. And then one of the other nationalists stands up and says, I move, we close the doors, we send the reporters home, and we all swear we won't tell anybody what we're doing until we're done. I'm not exaggerating. That's the second thing. And then the third thing was the governor of Virginia stands up and says, Mr. President, I have here a set of resolutions. I think we should have a national government with a national executive, a national legislature, and a national judiciary. And some of the delegates wrote that night, well, the Virginians want a national government? That's not what the state sent me here to do. And that's not what the Congress told us to do. And then they spent weeks arguing about that. About a third of the delegates went home saying, we weren't sent here to do this. I'm going to go home and make sure this is defeated. Virginia proposal included more than just saying they wanted national government. It also structured a national government. We should have a central legislature, both houses apportioned by population. It should have power to legislate on any important question. We should have a national judiciary. It should be able to hear any important case. We should give Congress a veto power over all state laws. And all of these proposals were voted down. So even in the Philadelphia Convention, where they're meeting in secret, and a lot of these people wanted a national government, they couldn't get it. When the convention ended, and it's very common people say James Madison was the father of the Constitution. Now, James Madison proposed this national model that was rejected completely, and if we had time I could go through a bunch of details and show you he lost over and over and over. Forrest McDonald of the University of Alabama, Pulitzer Prize nominee, calculated that on the majority of votes taken in the Philadelphia Convention, Madison was on the losing side. So I'm not sure why he's called the father of the Constitution. Actually, right after the convention ended, he wrote a letter to his friend Thomas Jefferson, who was in France. It had nothing to do with writing the Constitution. And every semester I tell my students, okay, Jefferson was in France. He had nothing to do with writing the Constitution. I guarantee you on the final, some of you would tell me that Jefferson wrote the Constitution. And every semester, some of them do. Now, where do we get this idea? Jefferson wasn't even in the country. But anyway, after the convention ended, Madison wrote a letter to his friend Jefferson in France, and he said, well, here's what we did. And he said, I think it's somewhat better than the Articles, but he said, it didn't have this, and it didn't have that, and I think therefore it'll fall apart within a few years. But I don't be in favor of ratifying it, but it's really not that good. Why didn't he like it? Because it wasn't a national government. That's what he wanted. Right? So the point is, the revolution was made on behalf of the federal government. The first time people made a federal constitution, it was federal. It left almost all authority in the state governments. Then the states sent these delegates to Philadelphia to propose amendments to the Articles of Confederation. Some of them tried, by having to meet in secret, and then making a proposal to this effect, to substitute a national model for the federal one, but they were defeated. Then, when they had finished drafting their federal constitution with only a few powers for Congress, no congressional veto over state laws, only some kinds of jurisdiction for federal courts, and on, they had to go out to the states and tell people, ratify this, it creates a federal system. It'll have limited powers. In fact, in Virginia, the governor, the same guy who stood up and said, I think we need a national government with a national legislature and so on, he had to go out and say, this government will only have the powers that are expressly delegated. Expressly. So the point is what? The point is, at every point, the nationalists are defeated. The revolution was made for the rights of state legislatures, Republican self-government through local legislative elections. That was why Patrick Henry objected to the Stamp Act. We've always had, the Kings told us in 1613, here in Virginia we would have the right to taxation only by our own local legislature. They didn't make the revolution against that principle, they made it for it. When they created the Articles of Confederation, it stood for that idea. Right? When they came up with this Constitution, it was a federal one. Even the nationalists who wanted the opposite model had to go out and sell it as federal. And then when they had the argument over whether to ratify the Constitution, the argument was not between some people who wanted a federal system and some people who wanted a national one. No. The two parties were the Federalists saying we want a federal system and the Anti-Federalists saying, no, we don't believe you. We think you're really nationalists. We want a federal system. Everybody was saying they wanted a federal system. The outcome was people didn't trust these Federalists because, well, they lied. So they insisted that as soon as the Constitution was ratified, there had to be amendments guaranteeing that the federal government couldn't violate this right and that right, and these rights and those rights. And in the end saying, and the federal government only had these two powers. That's what the 10th Amendment says. And one they tell you to ignore. In fact, when I was becoming an attorney, yeah, I'm afraid I used to be an attorney. I'm sorry. Before I got an education, I went to law school.